Will you join me in the spirit of prayer? Spirit of the living God, fall afresh upon us. Melt us, mold us, fill us, O God, use us. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, for you are without a doubt our rock, and you are our Redeemer. Amen. Remember, this is how the season of Lent began, in case you have forgotten. This parental reminder, it seems, don't you forget, seems to be the theme, a constant reminder of this season, a season of self-reflection so that we might learn to take the focus off of ourselves. It's a season that reminds us of that great spiritual truth of our shared ancient faith. As the prophets have proclaimed of this inward search, the prophets have proclaimed something like, if you don't check yourself, you will be bound to wreck yourself. Prophets indeed. To take the focus off of who we think we are and what we're doing, to move our eyes off of the mirror and the image gazing back at us, and to seek the Lord's presence continually and at all times, and to fall in love, it seems, with that which has undergirded us, the Spirit which holds us in the palm of her hand, and the one in whom we live and move and find our very being. It's a season of the search to sift through the dirt and the ashes, sifting through the ashes to see again for perhaps the first time. Joan Chittister writes, it's the seeking that counts. She says, it's easy to forget that simple truth in a capitalistic society that teaches us to win, to have, to amass, and to define the best of us as the one who has the most of these things. But in the God life, seeing is itself the end. We never get God, but we always have God. We never find God, but we forever dwell in God. And she concludes by saying, so if I'm seeking God, I have already come to God. To seek, to search, to sift through the ashes and the dust of who we are, and to find a God that has long been there from generation to generation. For this is the quest of a life that uncovers the rootedness of God at the very core of our very being. Now, just in case you have forgotten, I want to remind us all that we have been lied to. In case you have forgotten, we have been lied to. It's all been a big, fat lie that has been peddled, and in our consumer mindset, I'm afraid that we have bought it at a much inflated rate. We have gone to the marketplace and purchased our identities. Rather than going inward and finding God at the core of our identity, we have bought into the lies. Henry Nouwen, this great spiritualist, has rightly named those lies that have created for this great cover-up of our identity. I'm sure you've heard them. I am what other people say about me. I am what I do. I am what I have. But I'm afraid that we've gone a bit further down the road with this lie that we are what we have. I'm concerned that we've bought these lies about our identity, but not only that we have purchased them, but we've gone further in buying this extended warranty that is purchased at the checkout line. That not only do we believe that we are what we have, but we have what we have because we have somehow earned it on our own. That we've got to where we are without a little help from our friends. That we did it by God all by ourselves. The psalmist in this 105th division of the psalm advances this single explanation of Israel's foundation story, reminding these people of their identity. This whole story from the wandering of Abraham to the settlement of Israel in this land of Canaan is based on the Lord's promise to the land of Abraham. The psalm rightly praises the Lord, whose power was manifest in the wonderful works and the acts of judgment of which the story has been composed. The entire psalm is a reminder, don't you forget, of how God remembered God's promise to Abraham by God's own mighty works. Don't you forget God and God's promise. And don't you dare forget to praise God for God's faithfulness. But also, while we're in the mood to remember, don't you forget where you came from. The psalm views Israel as a people whose identity and destiny come to them from their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The psalm addresses the community as offspring of Abraham and children of Jacob. Their identity as a people of the Lord is rooted not in their own good deeds and accomplishments, but their identity as people of the Lord is rooted in God's relation to those ancestors. The relationship with the forefathers and the people is repeatedly named by the use of the words servant, chosen. In Israel's culture, servant, it was a term for a person who belonged to another, was identified, supported, and protected by that other, and did what he or she did for a person out of a covenant of belonging, not only to God, but the shared belonging to one another. This relationship, this, shall we call it ministry, is a ministry that takes the focus off of ourselves, causing us to stop patting ourselves on the back long enough to give God praise and to recognize that I am because they were, and I am because we are, and that there were ancestors that came before us. It did not start with us. It was a young Howard Thurman who, while wandering the countryside one day, saw an elderly man planting pecan trees. And this young Howard Thurman walks up to this elder and he says, "Sir, you've been planting these trees. You're around 70 or 80 years of age. You will not live long enough to taste the fruit from this tree." And the elder said, "Son, I have been eating from trees that I did not plant all my life. I should at least plant some trees and create some fruit for a generation that has not yet been born." There is always, in case you have forgotten, there is always someone who comes before us who quiets our rumbling stomachs and our grumbling spirits because of their planting. There is always someone who makes a way. There is always someone that came before us who partnered up with God's mission that is responsible for the liberation that we now know. Now, we know these names of Moses and Aaron because we have been reminded, seemingly as though the psalmist thinks that we might one day forget their names. Perhaps the psalmist knows that there are individuals who get lost on the cutting room floor, names lost in the footnotes of history's pages. We all know the name of Rosa Parks. But let us remember that 9 months before Rosa Parks' act of defiance in 1955, there was a 15-year-old girl by the name of Claudette Colvin. It was this teenager, Claudette Colvin, who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. There is always someone who comes before who makes a way. You see, without Claudette Colvin, there would be no Rosa Parks and no Montgomery bus boycott. But listen to this. Instead of resting on her laurels, instead of patting herself on the back, rather than taking credit and pointing at herself, Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old, pointed to those who came before. Claudette Colvin said she drew her strength from African-American abolitionists that she had just learned about in high school. She said, quote, "It felt like Harriet Tubman was pushing me down on one shoulder and Sojourner Truth was pushing me down on the other. They are the ones who put me in the patrol car," end quote. There is always someone who makes a way, who comes ahead of us, who puts the foundation under our stories, who's been a part of securing the flooring on which we collectively stand. There's a great deal of excitement, as I understand, and rightfully so, a great deal of excitement around the CTS community as this amazing community of theological education awaits the July arrival of Dr. David Malott. Is that pronunciation correct? Awaiting the arrival of the seminary's 7th president. Excitement of new leadership that will guide CTS into a new era of theological education rooted in values that God might recognize as God's own. But amidst all this excitement, remember, don't you forget that before there was Dr. David Mellett, there was a Bill Kincaid. And before there was a Bill Kincaid, there was a Matt Bolton. And before there was Matt Bolton, there was an Ed Wheeler. And before Ed Wheeler, there was a Dick Dickinson. And before Dick Dickinson, there was a T.J. Liggett. And before T.J. Liggett, there was a Buford Davis. And before Davis, there was an Ormond Shelton. And before Shelton, there were these 3 families, the Irwin, Miller, and Sweeney families. And before those families, there was Fred Kirshner. And before Fred Kirshner, there was this newly formed denomination called the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And before the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, there was a guy by the name of Ovid Butler. And before a Butler, there were these 2 cats from Scotland named Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone. And before Campbell and Stone, there was a Thomas Campbell. And before Thomas Campbell, there was Scottish Presbyterian Church. And before the Scottish Presbyterian Church, there was John Calvin. And before Calvin, there was Martin Luther. And before Martin Luther, there was a Thomas Aquinas. Before Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine. And before St. Augustine, there was Tertullian. And before Tertullian, there was Cyprian. And before Cyprian, there was Priscilla, Aquila, Phoebe, and Lydia. And before Aquila and Priscilla and Phoebe and Lydia, there was a Paul. And before Paul, there was a Peter. And before Peter, there was a Jesus. And before Jesus, there was a John. And before John, there was an Isaiah. And before Isaiah, there was a Solomon. Before Solomon, there was a David. Before David, there was a Saul. Before Saul, there was Samuel. Before Samuel, there was a Samson. And before Samson, there was a Deborah. And before Deborah, there was a Ruth. And before Ruth, there was a Joshua. And before Joshua, there was an Aaron. And before Aaron, there was a Moses. And before Moses, there was a Joseph. Before Joseph, there was a Jacob. Before Jacob, there was Isaac. Before Isaac, there was Abraham. Before Abraham, there was Noah. Before Noah, there was a Cain and Abel. Before Cain and Abel, there was an Adam and Eve. Before Adam and Eve, there was God. Who was in the beginning. There is always someone who comes before us, who sets a stage, who makes the way. And while we celebrate where we are and how far we've come from that Northwestern Christian University and the Butler School of Religion, let us not forget the very foundation on which we stand. And if the psalmist is to offer a model of, well, let's call it ministry, of servant leadership, one that prepares the way, and one that points to the waymakers, then let us not forget that we are called to foster a foundation that others might be able to firmly and safely stand. But that we are called to remember that it's all about God. That we remember the faithful service of those who came before, like those who make a way. We make a way by remembering that it is God's action through those human waymakers that got us to where we are. It is God's calling and active pursuit that got us here, and it is what keeps us going. In the words of the great scholar Robert Webber, when we are called by God, when we do things for God, then at best we are stagehands in this divine drama. And anybody knows that when you're a stagehand, you're not the star. You're supposed to make sure the light stays shining on the star. The psalmist in this season of Lent comes around with our annual ego check, reminding us stagehands of our job when we think we've got a starring role. When we begin to think that I did it all by myself. These humbling yet inspiring words of the psalmist, they ground us. They encourage us to pay attention to the very foundation of our story and inspire us to sing of that ancient truth: we are standing on holy ground, and it is holy, not because we are standing on it, but because God is in it. Remember, don't you forget, this foundation, your foundation, it is holy. Seek it, search it, sift through it, find it again and again. Leave only your footprints, but by God and in God and through God, make a way for others along the way.